Shabbat Shalom. This week I'll be looking into the fruitless fig tree. The fruitless fig tree. My wife and I were discussing um, the incident where Yeshua walks to Jerusalem with his disciples and he's hungry and he passes by a fig tree and there are no figs on the tree. And so he curses the fig tree and immediately it shrivels up and dies. So I thought it would be a good follow-on from what we have been discussing the last 3 weeks. I asked a question 2 weeks ago, are you grafted in? And that is taken from Paul's message to the Romans, and specifically chapter 11, in which he describes the Gentiles being grafted in to the natural fig tree, the Gentiles being wild, not figs, olives, the Gentiles being the wild olive branch that is grafted into the natural olive tree. And the fact that Yahuwah, God, Yahuwah, the personal name of God, that God cut off natural branches because of their rebellion to make space for the wild branches to be grafted in, and therefore the wild branches should not be conceited or arrogant. And so the wild branches should not lord it over the natural branches who gave space for them to be grafted in, but should be humble and recognize their place. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing now, but essentially, this is the message of Paul, that Gentiles should not be conceited. Gentiles should not be arrogant over Israel, over Jews, over those who are the natural branches. And so the question was, are you in fact grafted in? And the whole, what that message revolved around was essentially one's attitude, a Gentile or Christian's attitude towards Israel and towards the Jews and towards not really so much Israel and the Jews in the current political context, but the things of God, those things that God ordained and God said should be, the biblical things, the biblical customs, the biblical laws that God ordained. What is you as a Christian? What is your attitude towards those things? Do you come from the perspective that we are set free from the law, and so now we are under grace, and we no longer have to really observe those things? We don't have to worry too much about the whole Old Testament. What is your attitude towards those things? That was the crux of this message. What is your focus on those things, the things of God, and which are today regarded by the church as being Jewish things? They're not Jewish things, they are God-ordained things. So that was that message. Then we followed on last week with the message, are you even saved? And so my conviction is that if you are truly saved, then there should be a heart and a longing for the things of God, the things that God said, the things that God finds pleasing, those things that are pleasing to God, the things that He established would be things that are pleasing to Him. And so if we are truly saved, if we do truly love God, then it would go without saying that we should pursue the things of God. At the very least, we should want to know about the things of God. And so we should be studying the scriptures, searching the scriptures, especially the Old Testament, since it is 2/3 or more of the whole book. And it's really in the Old Testament where we find the character and the nature and the heart of God, Yahuwah God. The New Testament and Yeshua, the Messiah, is the fulfillment of all of that. And so we really find the heart of God in the Old Testament. And so we should be about that. And so I really went into what salvation is, the sin that separates us from God, the need for a turning back to God, which is the definition of the word repent. It's turning back. And then how? The way to God that is acceptable to God, and the life that we are to live. And Yeshua, of course, is the ultimate example of that life. And so Yeshua lived that life perfectly, to perfection. We have no chance of living that life perfectly because we have already messed up. So even if we manage to live that life perfectly from now on, we've already still messed up our history, our past. We were born um, messed up, if I can use that expression. It's not a politically correct expression to use, but we were born in sin because we were born in the image of Adam. And of course, Adam sinned, and so we were born in sin, and we have a natural inclination to sin. And so we have already messed up, as it were. And so we need a sacrifice that is perfect in order to be reconciled to that God. So that was last week's message. And then I thought this week it would be a good, at the suggestion of my wife, it would be a good follow on, because it's one of the evidences. Last week I asked the question, I pointed you to the exhortation of the Apostle Paul in Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, in which he says, examine yourself, test yourself, examine yourself to see whether you be in the faith. And this is something everyone who claims to be a believer should do, and should be constantly aware of, and constantly checking up and measuring, is this examining yourself to see whether you be in the faith. And one of the evidences that you are in the faith is this issue of bearing fruit. We were made to bear fruit. And so Matthew 21, I'll read it for you. Matthew 21, verses 18 to 22. Matthew 21, verses 18 to 22. This incident where Yeshua it's coming close to his crucifixion, and he's going up to Jerusalem with his disciples, and he's hungry. He comes across this fig tree. Now early in the morning, as he was returning to the city, he became hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came up to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree shriveled up at once. When the disciples saw it, they were astonished. "How did the fig tree shrivel on the spot?" they asked. Yeshua answered them, "Amen, I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' it will happen. And whatever you ask in prayer, trusting, you shall receive." And so what I want to focus on in that passage are the words, "if you have faith and do not doubt." Many have used this passage, and the context of the passage is prayer and answered prayer. But I believe that it's a lot more than that. The deeper spiritual context is God is not so much concerned with our physical circumstances as he is with our spiritual circumstances, and us as believers is mostly concerned with our reaching out to others in consciousness of their spiritual circumstances. And so the shriveling of the fig tree, though it was a physical demonstration, I don't believe it really had so much to do with giving the disciples the power to go and shrivel up fig trees wherever they go, or to necessarily go and move mountains, physical mountains being thrown into the sea. I believe the lesson and the instruction was more from the spiritual perspective, and it demonstrates the authority that Yeshua was given, and he passes on to us, essentially, his disciples first, and then down the line it is continued. The authority to exercise, this is the critical point, the authority to exercise the will of God on earth. not my own will. Later in John, he says, whatever you ask in my name. And that expression, in my name, is the correct translation from the or the name, or the in the name of. If we go to the Hebrew and the Aramaic, the correct translation of that, or the meaning of it, if something is done in someone's name, it's not a epithet we add onto the end of whatever we do in our prayers. We always pray in the name of Jesus. That's not what it means. Essentially, that expression points to what it really means. And what it really means is the power and authority. I do this, I pray this in the power and authority of Yeshua, not my own power and authority, but in the power and authority of Yeshua, who had the power and authority of Yahuwah, who is the one and only true God. And so essentially, we are praying and we are acting. If we are acting in the will of God, then we are praying and acting in the power and authority of God. And therefore, there is nothing that can stand in our way. And the greater power than the fig tree or the mountain are the spiritual forces that would oppose us. And essentially what the message is that we have the power and authority of God if we are acting according to his will. And then there is no limit. When we are acting in the will of God, there is no limit, because God is all powerful. He is the creator. And so he's all powerful, and there is nothing that we could not do when it is done in the will of God. The essential words, this is why I'm pointing and focusing to these words, are if you have faith. Firstly, so faith, if you have faith, that we normally interpret that to mean if we have sufficient belief that this can be done or this could be done, or what it really means is if we have been reconciled, if we have repented. In other words, if we have turned back to God and therefore been reconciled to God, and we have submitted ourselves, our lives, and our wills to God, to the will of God. That is true faith. It is putting our trust and our hope, our confidence, our future in God and not ourselves. And therefore we live and we act in accordance with the will of God. Our desire is to do the will of God. That is true faith. And he qualifies that by saying, and do not doubt. Because true faith, the evidence of true faith, is that we trust that God is able. And therefore we have no doubt. We have no fear, we have no doubt, because God is able. We put our trust in him. He is able, and therefore there is no doubt. And so essentially, if you have faith and do not doubt, then you will be one who is acting, praying, and acting according to the will of God and not your own. And therefore, anything is possible. And the consequence of that, you are now grafted in, you are truly saved, and therefore, and the consequence of that is that you will bear fruit. And this is the measure, or one of the measures, one of the evidences that you can consider in your own life to see whether or not you be in the faith. If you take the words of Paul and you apply them and you examine yourself, test yourself to be whether you are in the faith, then this is one of those measures. Are you bearing fruit? My question today is, are you bearing fruit, or are you a fruitless fig tree? If the fig tree represents the fig tree, the only purpose of a fig tree is to bear fruit, to produce food, bear fruit. That's the purpose. And it's the very same purpose that we have in the kingdom of heaven. Our purpose is to bear fruit. And so essentially the spiritual context of this passage is The tree represents the believer. The believer's sole responsibility is to bear fruit, ever more so when the king is present. And so it was the opportunity for that fruit tree to shine when the king came by and was hungry. And it was found doing what it was meant to do. Remember the parable of the servants and the servants who were found doing, the servants who the master took a long time, and so they began to eat, drink, and be merry with the rest because the master was taking a long time. And when the master came, they were unprepared, and they were not doing what the master had instructed them to do. And blessed is he who is found doing what the master instructed them to do. And so similar situation. The fig tree represents the believer. The fruit represents the believer doing what they were created to do, bear fruit. And this tree was unprepared. This tree was not fulfilling its function. It's another story. Mark, the parallel passage in Mark tells us that it wasn't the season for figs. So that's another story about what, there are lots of analogies we can extrapolate from this situation, from this event. One of them is that fig trees can have early figs. And so another element of the story we can extrapolate is to always be prepared, to always be producing, even out of season or in a bad season, or the times when it's tough and rough and we're going through trials, to still constantly be producing fruit. And so there are two aspects to the fruit that we are to produce. There is spiritual fruit and there is physical fruit. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the physical fruit because the spiritual fruit is easier, I think, a little bit easier to understand. It's something which wells up from within us, and it's not necessarily something that you actively try to make happen. If you are truly saved, it's something that should flow, come out of you naturally. And the physical fruit is the thing that people have the most problem with, especially today in the church today, in this age of grace, and we are no longer under the law, and therefore any mention of works is frowned upon and seen as denying Christ. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the physical fruit because of that. So the spiritual fruit is fairly straightforward. Paul tells us what the spiritual fruit is. He's just described what the works of the flesh are. Galatians 5. Still the Apostle Paul. Galatians 5, verses 22 to 25. He's speaking about walking in the Spirit, and the deeds of the flesh are obvious, and he lists off all a number of sins which are obviously deeds of the flesh. And then he comes to verse 22 and he says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And so there is no law because all of those things fit inside the law. In other words, if you were to obey the law perfectly as you would according to the way it has been expressed and revealed, then you would be doing those things. These are the things that are what the law contains. The law, as we know, is the schoolmaster which teaches right and wrong. And so the law teaches us that these are good things. And so when you are filled with the Spirit, in other words, when you are a true believer and the Spirit of God guides you and instructs you and leads you into all truth, then you will be full of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So the fruits of the Spirit, the spiritual fruits, are things that are in your heart which come out in your life and your expression and your attitude towards others and circumstances. And so this is a spiritual fruit. Okay, one of the ways in which you can measure yourself to know, am I like this? Is this how is Luke 6 verse 45? Um, Yeshua tells us, and Luke has recorded it in chapter 6 verse 45, that out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so it's another topic that my wife and I have been discussing of late, is the truth that people reveal when they're under pressure, when they're under stress, when they are drunk, um, when elderly folk begin to go into this little bit, but yeah, dementia and Alzheimer's, then um, those filters that you would have normally in your everyday walk, those filters which you present to the world, through which you filter your bad characteristics, and so present yourself to the world as being good and clean and fresh. Those filters are removed by those things: stress, anxiety, inebriation, and when you start to lose those filters in mental faculties. And so then you get to see some of the truth of what's really in a person's heart. And so, as Yeshua says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. When you push someone and you see their response, and their natural reaction comes out before they have a chance to put the filter up, we see something of the true nature of a person. So that's a way in which you can self-regulate, see how you're doing on the spiritual fruits. Are you displaying love, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control? So inanimate objects like guns, for example, I'll get into trouble here. It's not guns that kill; it's people that kill. And so they will use guns, or they'll use anything else that they have to kill. And so when we say, well, guns are evil, it's not the guns that are evil. Guns can be very useful. They provide food and so on, protection. It's the self-control that is within people who have spiritual fruit that is what keeps harmony and equilibrium in society. So the physical fruits, those are the spiritual fruits. I think they're fairly easy to understand. The physical fruits, this is the great difficulty that people have. And I want to go to John 15. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, and then we will close in John 15. Because John 15, actually 14 and 15, if you read the whole lot in its context, it's very explicit and quite clear. If you take the simple reading, you don't have to go into deep theological analysis. Just take the simple reading of John 14 and 15 as it stands, and it's very clear to me. The focal verse is verse 8, John 15, verse 8, and Yeshua is speaking, and he says, "In this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." And so this bearing of fruit is, as I've been saying, and the purpose of this message is that it is an evidence that you are true disciples, that if you bear fruit. And what is the fruit that Yeshua is referring to? The whole context of the latter part of 14 and 15 is obedience. And so the fruit, if I'll focus on just a few verses, chapter 14, verse 31, "But in order that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father has commanded me." In order that the world may know that I love the Father, I do exactly as the Father has commanded me. This is Yeshua. This is our example of how to live. And how did he live? He did exactly what the Father commanded. He goes on to say, chapter 15 from verse 1, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he trims, so that it may bear more fruit. Anyone who gardens knows that if you prune a tree, it will bear more. If you trim the growth ends off, it will encourage fruit. He takes away, and every branch that bears fruit he trims so that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I will abide in you. The branch cannot itself produce fruit unless it abides on the vine. Likewise, you cannot produce fruit unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Verse 7, he goes on to say, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it shall be done for you. In this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. Just as the Father has loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. Just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. Now I have called you friends, because everything I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and selected you so that you would go and produce fruit, and your fruit would remain. Then the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. These things I command you, so that you may love one another. So many people will say, oh, well, Yeshua gave us a new commandment, to love one another. And so that's it. We don't have to worry about the rest, the old. The commandment that he gave was merely a summary of the commandments that God gave. The words that he spoke were all the words that God gave him to speak, which were not one contradicts the Old Testament and what God had already commanded throughout the scriptures. And so, again, we see the example that to bear fruit, the ultimate fruit, of course, is the salvation of souls, people being saved through our witness and our example. And so, obeying God, obeying Yeshua, will result in fruit. It is those things which are the life that we spoke about last week, which produce that lifestyle that we spoke about last week, and that will ultimately result in fruit of souls coming to know God, to be reconciled to their Creator God, because of the word of our testimony and our example. Just as we follow the words of Yeshua, the word of his testimony and his example, so we are to be both a voice and an example to others. In this way, we bear fruit which is pleasing to God and proves that we are Yeshua's true disciples. So I pray that you will go and bear fruit for the glory of God. Amen. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.